Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for joining this live webinar hosted by Keating Chambers this morning. My name is Oliver Goldsmith and I am the Arbitration and ADR Clerk here at Keating Chambers, and I manage the ADR practices, including those of our mediators. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce you to three of those who are today's speakers. Rosemary Jackson QC, Fionnuala McCready QC and Robert Evans. Over the next 40 minutes or so, the three speakers will offer some practical advice on virtual mediation, drawing on their recent experience. They will then follow that with a Q&A session, and so please do use the chat function on the right hand side of your screen if you'd like to ask them a question. I think that's enough from me, so I'll hand you over to our first speaker, Mr. Robert Evans.
Thanks, Ollie, and good morning. In some respects, I feel I drew the short straw having to deal with technology for mediations. But what I would say is that if I can manage it, which I'd like to think I can, I think everybody should be able to. I'm sure many of you have experience of remote court or arbitration hearings, and Keating Chambers has run a series of very helpful webinars which cover topics such as remote hearings in the TCC, and I commend those to you. Much of what is relevant to remote court hearings applies equally to mediations, save that there are two very significant differences. In court, the trial will start and will continue, generally with the judge and the advocates in picture, until an adjournment for everyone is called. In contrast, in mediation, first, the mediator will both want and indeed need to see all the participants, whether decision maker, expert or legal advisor. Secondly, the mediator and some of the time the parties will be dipping in and out of rooms, whether the room of one party or a plenary session room. Often the mediator will be shuttling between rooms, leaving a party to consider and discuss an offer and possible counter-offer before returning. Each party will need its own private virtual room which the mediator can enter, and there will need to be one or more rooms for plenary sessions or other breakout meetings, perhaps between decision makers or experts. But that does not, I don't think, make the technology any harder to use. The key in my view, and I don't want to trespass on Fionnuala's territory here, but the key is preparation. It's absolutely essential that all participants in the mediation attend a technology test so that all of them understand and are comfortable with the technology and how it works, so that during the mediation itself, they can concentrate on the issues arising in the mediation rather than any technology issue. This test ideally will take place well before the mediation, so that if any issues do arise, they can be ironed out well before the mediation starts. As to the choice of video technology, there are many platforms, including Skype, Skype for Business, BlueJeans, and GoToMeeting. I do not endorse any particular platform, but I have used successfully both Teams and Zoom, and recently used Teams and Zoom in the same mediation, with one party on Teams and the other on Zoom. In some respects, that is a good approach because it's far more difficult for the mediator to go into the wrong room if the parties are on different platforms. The downside with that, of course, is that a joint or plenary session or other breakout becomes much more difficult, if not impossible. I would say in the case that I did, neither party was keen on a plenary session at the outset, and it was not necessary during the course of the day. However, I think the better solution is to have all parties on the same platform, if possible. Zoom, for example, has a breakout room feature which permits the host or a co-host to set up a breakout room and allocate people to these rooms. I have to say I've not used this as yet, but I can see that it would have real benefits. An alternative may just be to send out a new meeting invitation to, say, the experts, so that they can have a private meeting with or without the mediator. One of the questions we've been asked in advance of this webinar is our view on the comparative utility of the various platforms. I've only used Zoom and Teams and have no strong preference. They have similar features and are both easy to use. I know from talking to Fionnuala that she has found Skype for Business less easy to use, and I think describes it, which seems to be the term of art for describing video platforms. She found it rather clunkier than Teams. Again, from speaking to Rosemary, I understand that her preference is Zoom if there are more than two parties, as other platforms are again clunkier when it comes to multiple rooms. For two parties, generally only 3 rooms are necessary, and these can be set up on a platform of choice with either party setting up its own room and the mediator hosting a third for breakouts or plenary sessions. Facilities for document sharing and whiteboards are also useful to have. Excuse me. I think everybody acknowledges and agrees that remote video hearings are actually quite intense and tiring, so that concentration levels can drop off. Again, I don't want to trespass on, this would be Rosemary's topic, but I find generally sessions need to be kept shorter than they would in real world face-to-face mediations. Also, participants may need to take time out for childcare or other duties. And again, I think Rosemary and Fionnuala will cover this. Be careful about the features of the technology and make sure you and all the participants understand them. Zoom and Teams both allow recording of the meeting to take place, and this clearly can be thoroughly undesirable. All parties should agree before the mediation not to record, and also not to permit any undisclosed person to listen into a video meeting. Keating Chambers has developed a protocol for video mediations, which covers a lot of this ground, and all participants are invited to agree and abide by it in advance of the mediation. It's absolutely essential that there is a backup or plan B. When I did my first virtual mediation, I had a webcam on my home desktop computer, but I also borrowed and loaded with the software my daughter's laptop, and I also had a tablet which I could fall back on if everything else failed. This, of course, proved to be complete overkill, but what I think is essential is to have other lines of communication if, for example, one party representative loses internet connection or some similar technology breakdown. I think most of the platforms have a facility to dial in by voice only until video access can be restored. That permits the individual to take part in the meeting, albeit without being able to be seen on video. I also arranged that a separate email is copied to all of the attendees from each party so that I can contact the whole group by email, and I would normally get in advance a telephone number for all of the key participants, although again I've never had cause to use them. And I should say a backup is essential, but throughout my whole lockdown experience I've never needed a backup. Now, how does it work in practice? I've only done two-party remote mediations, and there is nothing groundbreaking to this, but I have found, using, for example, Zoom, that it works well for an invitation to be sent out by each party, usually by the legal representative, and one from the mediator to all participants. Usually each party will look for its team to meet before the mediator joins, so that the start time before the mediation starts is sensible. The mediator can then simply join, leave and rejoin that meeting at any time using the same invitation, with the party team always in the same meeting. In many respects, exactly the same as real-world mediations. Talking of start times, I seem to be starting mediations much earlier than in the old world. Whereas in the old world, we generally start at 10 or 10:30. Now I seem to be starting regularly at 9:30. I suspect this is entirely due to travel. Nobody has any travel time or any travel issues. Anyway, back to the procedure. Each party is then free to start their own pre-meeting before the mediator joins, again, as they would in the real world. Then at the appointed time, the mediator can simply join the meeting and spend time with that party. When it is time to move, the mediator simply leaves the meeting and is free then to meet with the other party or parties. They are likely to be in their own private meeting, so I would either warn them with an email that I would be joining in, say, 5 or 10 minutes, or try to join at or within a few minutes of a fixed and agreed time. Some platforms have a waiting room so that the mediator can join, but will have to be admitted by the party host. Again, this works well. As I've already suggested, and I'm sure Rosemary will speak more about this, I think it is really helpful to keep the private meetings with each party much shorter than one would in the real world mediation. Talking about technology, I've mentioned phone numbers, and it is of course possible to have a purely telephone mediation. And indeed the first mediation I did in the early in the lockdown was by telephone. I won't say much about it because I'm sure you're all familiar with the technology, but what I would say is that I simply wouldn't recommend it compared to video mediation. But it is an option albeit an unsatisfactory one in my view. You've probably heard in discussions about remote court hearings, clients, experts and legal teams may have a WhatsApp group or an email group to pass messages around during the hearing. This can be used in mediation, but actually because the mediator is out of the room for a significant part of the day, it may not be necessary and is certainly less important than in, for example, a court hearing. Other technology. I now try and get the mediation agreement signed by all parties and participants before the mediation day. But if that has not been done, there is software available that permits a document to be signed electronically over the web. DocuSign is one that I've used, and I know that Rosemary's used it recently as well. I'm not seeking to promote it, and other document signature software is available, but it is something to bear in mind. This is something that may be of assistance too in signing a settlement agreement. Of course, call me old-fashioned, but an alternative is to print, sign and scan the document, but this only works if the facilities are available. Finally, just seeing how I'm doing on time. Finally, just a word on bundles. I think at least for the duration of the lockdown, hard copy bundles are unlikely to be available. Electronic bundles can be provided in a number of formats, from a simple emailed PDF through to a cloud-based document sharing website. Again, I don't endorse any particular approach, and the emailed PDF is only likely to work when the bundle is of a modest size. My philosophy, however, is to keep it as simple as possible so that not only the mediator can use it, but also all of the participants. This is something that needs to be agreed with all parties in advance. Finally, on bundles, a word of advice, and this is, I think, the advice counsel always gives, and mediators give it, arbitrators give it. Pagination is essential so that everyone can get to the same page and know that they are on the same page. Finally, I've not addressed matters such as security, and even though I use Zoom quite a lot now, it has had some very well publicised security concerns. As far as I understand it, many of those have been addressed, but the parties must be comfortable with using it from a GDPR point of view as well as security generally. Having said that, I now pass the baton to Fionnuala, who I think will talk through preparation for the mediation.
Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. I think we're all familiar with the challenges of working from home, and they're not new. Most of us remember this clip of an eminent professor whose small children and his poor wife video bombed a live BBC interview. In some ways, working from home has got easier in lockdown and more human because people are more understanding of the necessity to juggle work and home life. Despite all of that, if you told me a year ago that it would be possible to successfully mediate via video link, I would have been pretty sceptical, most immediately because of the importance of the human relationships in mediation, which contribute so much to its success. And Rosemary will be talking about that after my slot. But to my surprise, it turns out that it's not only possible, but in some ways it's better and more efficient. But in order to make that happen, we've got to keep in mind the unique challenges that we're all experiencing during lockdown. Robert's mentioned homeschooling and childcare responsibilities, which affects the working day for some of the participants, and certainly has in the mediations that I've done so far. And people have other caring responsibilities. There's no magical arrival of the catering in the mediation rooms, and indeed some of the people who are participating are responsible for magicking food up for the rest of their family. And so I have now set particular times for breaks so people know they can do it. It is also more tiring, as Robert has said, both for the participants and for the mediator. And finally, I think when participants are remote, it's more challenging, but not impossible, to make and keep a team atmosphere and to maintain interest, commitment and engagement. And contrary to Robert's experience, mine has been that there have been shorter working days on the mediations that I have done for that reason. So starting, one I did started, didn't start till 11 and people wanted to finish it at 6 o'clock. However, it is eminently possible to successfully mediate. Rosemary, Robert and I have been doing it since lockdown started, and with, as I say, success. I'd like to share my experience of the preparations for that success, and my firm view is that success lies in preparation beforehand and in persuading the parties to invest more time than they might otherwise spend beforehand to pave the way for success on the day itself. So I'm going to go through what you can do by email contact beforehand, then move on to what I think is the most important change to the mediation process, which is pre-mediation calls, video calls beforehand, in order to prepare for the substantive dispute itself, and finally to exchange more information, essential information, to allow the parties to come to a settlement. Robert's talked about the technology and the difficulties that it can cause, and I too would not describe myself as an early adopter of technology, but I'm surprised at how successful it has been. It just requires a bit of preparation again. So beforehand by email, sorting out the technology is essential. I've got one mediation which I did where it took us 4 goes. Having even agreed a technology platform, we had to swap because it didn't work. And fortunately, we'd started a long way before the day itself in order to make sure that we got it. And we had 4 different sets of video calls before we managed to light on one that worked and meant all the participants could take a proper part in the mediation. Robert's mentioned our video protocol. Again, it's essential. It's essential to get people to sign up to that, which deals with a lot of the security aspects and gives everybody comfort about a shared understanding about how it will proceed. And it's in black and white. Again, canvassing views on the need for a plenary session, what the arrangements for that might be, whether there's a need for screen sharing and so forth. So all of that can be thought about early so that it on the day works smoothly. Robert's already mentioned signature of the mediation agreement. I try really hard now to get it done in advance because of the what I've mentioned, the issues of a shorter working day. You just don't want anything to clog up the day itself, and you want to hit the ground running, as it were, on the day. I've talked about working hours. My experience is shorter, and I think that's better because people get tired, and as I say, there are home responsibilities. Also, I have always had a backup plan, which is everybody's emails addresses, obviously, and group emails and mobile numbers, and then a dial-in. I get the parties to arrange their own dial-ins in case they have to use that instead of a room if a mast goes down somewhere and there's no broadband, and I organise a dial-in for a plenary session, so that we know that we're always going to be able to communicate with each other. So moving on past email, pre-mediation calls, videos and preliminaries. It's really important to have video calls with the parties beforehand, even though for very many of us, every day is a bad hair day now. But I am told that on the 4th of July, hairdressers are reopening. So video calls. As Robert said, it's essential to test access for everybody and to make sure people can take a full and proper part in the day itself. But also what it starts to do is to establish relationships and to build trust with the individuals in a process where you're not in a room with them. I think that's very important. And again, it helps to shorten things on the day. They already know the mediator knows them, and you can start to see how the virtual room works with that particular party. I also use it now to give my introduction to mediation, to talk about it being a safe space, and to do the things that I would ordinarily do either in the party meeting on the day itself or in the plenary session, or probably both. And I think that in a process which is new to most people who are involved in it, it's really important to get them comfortable with it. And so repetition is quite helpful in doing that. Because of the need to test the technology, you do need to have everybody involved, even if they think, well, that's not normal, it's normal just to have a call with the solicitor. But it has a benefit for the day itself, and as I say, I think it starts to build trust and understanding, and you get to know people. It's also an opportunity to explain how virtual mediation is different and to get people's buy-in to more preparation beforehand to make it a success on the day. Again, you can run through communications on the day. I do use mobile phone numbers because sometimes rather than virtually knocking on the door, it's easier to give someone a quick call and say, look, can I come into your room now? And also to update a room by saying, look, I'm going to be another 10 minutes with the other party. So if anybody needs a break now, this is a good time to take it. And finally, it's very important to establish what constraints individuals are in the room with the safety of not being in a plenary session. So I always establish who's got specific responsibilities, such as homeschooling or young children or other caring responsibilities. And we make plans to accommodate that. And I think it's essential to make those people feel supported and to understand that they are understood and that they can make a success of the day because they're not constantly worrying about a toddler or signing into homeschooling. So that's the technology and the pre-call. People and communications on the day. Obviously, one needs to establish who is actually attending. You need to establish authority. Those are things we always have to do. It's important to know what the existing relationships are with the other side, and that might be something you'd normally establish in the morning of the first morning of the mediation. But again, knowing about it, having people thinking about it beforehand, starts everybody thinking creatively of what individual sessions there might be, whether the principals could meet to talk about this or that, and I try and cover that in an early mediation video call with the parties. Again, I've talked about the plenary session. Robert, Rosemary and I have discussed this, and practices differ. I'm a fan of plenary sessions because I think it helps people to be able to tell their story. There's no hard and fast rule, obviously, but what I have always done in the virtual mediations that I've done is I've got everybody into a virtual room at the beginning and asked people to introduce themselves, because I think we're on a common enterprise on the day, and actually having got together in a room, seen everybody's faces is really important. And just pausing on the technology, on Skype, you can only see 4 people, as I, from my experience, but on Teams it's 9. On Zoom, I think it's sort of almost infinite, which is something to think about. And I'm not, as I say, I'm not advocating a technology. I haven't done a Zoom mediation yet, but being able to see each other's faces, to know that you're all in the virtual room together, is important. Again, more than usual, I talk about what's going to happen in the plenary session. I get them to think about it, and I have even, at a party's request, watched their planned plenary introduction, to make sure that it strikes the note that they want to strike, and to make sure that it's understandable. And then finally, making plans for and practicing document sharing, PowerPoint and Excel, etc. beforehand is really important, because for many people it's the first time they've done it. So finally, documents and information. Robert's talked a little bit about this. I think, again, because we're all working remotely, because we're reliant upon electronic bundles, there's no ringing someone back at the office to get them to bring over X or Y. There's less time to plug gaps, and it might be harder for materials to be tracked down and shared. So it's essential to do as much as possible beforehand. I've already mentioned the mediation agreement. Position papers are even more important than normal, and I think they should be exchanged as far ahead of time as ever possible. Robert's talked already about bundles and arrangements for sharing, but again, what you don't want is to be dumping material on people at the last minute, because people have shorter working days because of all the other responsibilities they have. They can't just hand over the childcare in the way that we used to be able to. I also think that having a reply statement is can be very helpful. Again, in the old days, you would have thought, no, that's burdening a mediation with something like pleadings. But I think it's worth thinking about now, because the more progress you can make beforehand, the earlier you can start to get concessions and so forth, the better it is for the process. Which leads me to the next bullet point, which is about early concessions. In order to keep people's interest and to keep the momentum of the mediation, it's really important that people make concessions earlier than they would have done in a face-to-face mediation. You've got to make progress. You've got to keep people engaged in that process. And as I say, it's a challenge when you can't walk into the room and say, actually, look, guys, it's going fine. So I say to people they got to make earlier concessions, and encourage people to give me confidential papers so that I understand better what their position is. And in that call, I also ask them whether they've got all the information they need in order to be able to settle the case, and if not, make it my business to try and obtain that for them. And again, I talk to them about what their expectations are for the day, what their strengths and weaknesses are. I always give out mediation exercises for the parties to do beforehand, with costs and BATNAs and WATNAs and so forth. And again, I think that's a really helpful thing to return to at some point in the mediation day. In conclusion, it's working. This process of virtual mediation is working. It's worked for all of us. And I'd just like to conclude by reading an endorsement that Rosemary received as real feedback. It's not a surprise to any of us that she receives a ringing endorsement, because she's a very fine mediator. But this is new to us all, and it's good to read it. So what somebody said to her is, as regards the virtual mediation process today, I think the feedback can only be positive. The process ran smoothly, and in many ways, virtual mediations are more efficient than face-to-face mediations. Obviously, travel time is cut for all attending. From our point of view, we did not feel inhibited in any way during the process, and everybody had an opportunity to contribute. And on that great note, I'd like to hand over to Rosemary Jackson, QC.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala. As Fionnuala says, I've been asking people for feedback as I've gone along. I've done a number of mediations now in lockdown. Some of them by telephone with up to 5 parties, more with video up to 6 parties. And I'd absolutely agree with Robert, video is far preferable rather than a whole lot of disembodied voices. It's very hard on the phone. And the tech does work brilliantly when it works. We're all going to struggle with tech going down, but it is something that does work. And I've got a bit more feedback just on that general point that I'd like to share with you. And this was from a Zoom mediation virgin who emailed me afterwards in answer to my request for feedback, and said, I would find it hard to justify a face-to-face mediation given the choice over a virtual Zoom mediation, particularly where parties have substantial travel or logistical issues, struggling to find too many negatives. So that is really quite a ringing endorsement. And what I wanted to share with you is partly from the feedback I've received and partly from my own experiences, what the human experience is like, the interaction with each other and how you get through the day. Because I think that that's really very important for us. We can set up the technology, we can do the prep, but it's got to be a day that we can get through and come out intact at the other end. So I thought I'd start with the mediator's perspective. And you've heard about how many faces you can get on a screen. And again, I don't endorse anything, but when I've had a Zoom mediation, I've got all the faces on the screen in front of me. And it's fantastic. There might be 30 people, and there frequently are 25 or 30 people. They're all there, all their faces, and it's only faces, but you can see a lot to that. I think when you're on a platform that limits the number of faces you can see, that's probably more difficult. But from the mediator's point of view, if I was in a face-to-face mediation in the plenary session at the beginning of the day with 30 people, I'm at the head of a great big table and these people are all around me. And as people are making presentations, I want to be able to see how everybody's reacting. And it's really difficult to do in a big room full of people, because I find the only way I can really do it is to go around scanning faces. And it's very clear that that's what I'm doing, and that makes people feel uncomfortable. This is brilliant. They're all in front of me. I can zoom in on a face that I want to look at more carefully. I can see everybody's reactions, and I'm there ready to react very quickly if I need to. If someone's about to blow, I can see it before it happens. So that's really useful for me. Even more usefully for me, and those who've mediated with me know I have a terror of forgetting people's names. I think there's nothing worse than the mediator calling you by the wrong name all day. In this, it's beautiful. Everybody's got their name on the screen in front of them. And if they haven't, or if they've just joined by telephone, I can change their name. I can click on the dots and I can put their name there. So I feel really comforted because I know who everybody is. I haven't got to have those awkward conversations in a room in the afternoon saying, John wants to speak to you, but which one's John? Is he the one with the beard? This gives me a lot of comfort, and I feel as though I'm not going to be at risk of offending anybody. So that's brilliant. The other thing is the extreme efficiency of online mediation. I'm sure you've all been to Zoom drinks parties and lunches and things. There's no such thing as being fashionably late anymore. Everybody's there on time. If I say the plenary session is going to start at 9:30, everybody's there at 9:30 waiting for me to switch it on. It's brilliant. In a face-to-face mediation, party A is late. They want to wait till their insurer's turned up. Party B are all there, but they'd like to have a private chat before they come into the plenary session, and they'd like 10 minutes, which become 20, which become 30. Party C, meanwhile, I've got a decision maker who's all fired up. He's got a written statement he's prepared. He wants to read it out, and he's really frustrated by the fact that he was ready and nobody else is, and he's getting more and more wound up. All of that goes on the video. Hopefully I've already had a video meeting with the parties, so we've built a bit of rapport. I know them. Everybody's ready to crack on. I think it probably saves an hour, or at least half an hour at the beginning of the day, and also avoids all of that frustration. You're straight into doing something useful. I can't deny that there is an initial terror. I don't believe mediators don't feel absolute terror at the beginning of mediation. Is my laptop going to crash, as it did the other day? Luckily, I didn't have a mediation. I woke up one morning and I had nothing. Am I going to put people in the wrong rooms when I move them into virtual breakout rooms? Am I going to share my shopping list instead of the document setting out what their cost risks are? Those are all terrors, and I'm sure we all suffer from those. But once you get over that, I find the video platforms very seductive, because I think what we do as mediators is, or some people would call it choreography, I call it puppetry. We're moving people in and out of spaces. We're engineering conversations. We're saying, would you like to have a chat with so-and-so? And I can do that at the flick of a switch. I can send a broadcast warning to everybody, if it's something that can be published to everybody, saying in 2 minutes time, I'm going to move you all back into this room. Or I can send an email to two parties saying I'm going to send your decision makers into a room. And then it just happens. I get very carried away with it, I think, and I appreciate that it's a bit discombobulating sometimes for people. They're in the middle of a conversation and then they're whisked out of that conversation and they find themselves somewhere else. But as far as efficiency is concerned, it's a brilliant thing. And some of the feedback I've had has also endorsed that. Somebody said the speed with which the mediator can reassemble parties for plenary or private sessions was another positive and works faster than the real thing. And it really does. If I think about a multi-party mediation, if I've got 6 parties and I want to get 4 of them together for a meeting, I have to knock on their doors. I say, would you mind coming to a meeting, please? They say, what's it going to be about? Tell us what it's about. I can, no, please wait till we're all together and I'll tell you then. They say, well, by the way, before we go in, could you tell us whether you, did you pass that question on and have you got an answer? And have I got time to go to the toilet first? And ultimately they say, I'll be with you in 5 minutes. I end up in the main room, 3 parties arrive and I have to go and chase the 4th. And it can take half an hour just to get everybody together. And it's the work of seconds in a virtual mediation. So again, it's efficiency. I think I have to be a bit careful personally with being a bit too harsh with people and whisking them out unexpectedly, but with warning, and as people get more familiar with that, I think that that's a real bonus. You know, we can get through things more quickly. Something I've noticed though about the way people behave is that people are more direct. There's far less waffle. People tend only to speak when they need to. They might have had a point they would have made in a person-to-person mediation, but they don't. They hold their fire because they're on screen and they don't want to prolong the sessions. But because they're a bit more direct, sometimes it can be a bit abrasive. People might take things wrong, whereas face-to-face you might say things more subtly. I think over the screen they come over a little less softly. So I think that's something to be careful of, because we have to be very careful to take care of the people at the mediation. In every mediation, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, I feel very responsible for the welfare of the people attending. I'm in charge of the process, I've set it up, and I have to make sure they're okay. And although our work is largely commercial, that doesn't mean extreme emotions aren't at play. Someone's job may be on the line, depending on how this dispute goes. Their company may go under if this dispute doesn't work. It may be an existential dispute they've got to settle it today if they can. The stresses it's causing maybe in their marriage is on the line. You just don't know. And some people are more sensitive to criticism. Some people you can make an argument about something they've done and they just take it on the chin. Other people take it as a real personal affront, and there's an adrenaline rush and they're really struggling to sit at a screen, staying calm and functioning and processing things. And even in face-to-face mediations, I've had occasions when I have been genuinely concerned about the physical and mental health of people at the mediation. Is someone about to have a heart attack? Is someone just not going to be able to cope any longer? Has someone just got to go and lie down? Even what's that person going to do? They've just stormed out of the building. Are they going to do something awful? And all those things happen. And I think in a virtual mediation, it's really magnified. It's a far greater risk. Someone's trapped in their home. They don't have the separation of business and home. They may be sitting in the kitchen, their spouse is in and out making tea for the children. They can hear the children in the next room. The cat's crying. I'm sorry, you probably heard my cat crying then. I'm not letting him in. I couldn't help it then. All these things are happening, and it's really difficult for people to handle sometimes. So I think we have to be very, very careful of people's welfare, and I think we owe it to ourselves to check our own safety and to check the safety of those on the screen with us and those in our teams, and really beware of those vulnerabilities and act. And particularly at the end of a mediation, you don't have a session when the mediator says goodbye and then you're left in your room. The lawyers, the experts, the party are there to just sort of wind down. You just turn the screen off and it's all over. And it's sort of a dead feeling. And I think that's a very vulnerable time as well. So I think that's something really important that we need to have in mind. And we can do lots of things to keep ourselves healthy. I always insist that we stop for lunch. Everybody's got to step away from their screens and not speak about the case for 30 minutes. We have to keep video sessions short and manageable, as has already been mentioned. I'm not good enough at that. I get carried away with a point that's being discussed. And I think I need to give people more comfort breaks. And I will try to do that better. But every time I leave people, I say, you know, try and get away from the screen. Try, if you've got a door, go out of the door. If you can open a window, you go jump up and down a bit, hydrate yourself, get some healthy snacks, jump up and down, dance with the children. These are all things actually you can't do in a face-to-face mediation. I think there are opportunities, because if you're in a city law firm's air-conditioned offices all day, you may have a window, you may not. All you see is the four walls of the room that you're in. And so actually we've got an opportunity to make it a lot more healthy. And for me, that includes being in control of my food intake. Dear lawyer clients, I love coming to your offices, and I love your sweets and biscuits, trays, dispensers, drawers. They're wonderful. But I find myself full of self-loathing at the end of the day sometimes, when, as afternoon turns into evening, I've hit the jelly beans or the chocolate eclairs, and instead of having dinner, I've just eaten a lot of sugar. So I know some people find that if they're at home, It can be distracting because they can just graze and eat unhealthy food all along. But if you really tell yourself that this is an opportunity, we know where the fridge is, we know where the salad is, we know where the nuts and raisins are, and you can actually cook dinner if you're going on into the evening, or have something ready. So you can look after yourself. I think it's really, really important. I think it's something I'll try and take back into face-to-face mediations, if and when we ever get back to those. So those are my perspectives on the human experience. I just want to share things that some of my participants have given me as feedback. Seeing people, obviously people perceive this in different ways. One feedback I had was seeing people you're working with is extremely important. You get a much better sense of how the mediation is progressing through body language and facial expressions, that I take as a positive endorsement. Somebody else, however, said you lose the ability to read body language and know where attention needs to be directed. You lose the ability to have to have discussions on the side as a result of reading that body language. And I can see there are different ways of looking at that, both far better than on the phone and better than not having a mediation at all, I suspect. There's something about the importance of the key players being on the screen. A lot of times, especially insurers, prefer to be on the end of a phone. They say the lawyers will come to the mediation, you can ring, and they can ring us if they need us. I think because you're already remote, having key players, key decision makers not on the call, but somewhere available on a phone is an extra degree of separation that makes it much more difficult. So I think I'm going to be encouraging people to get everybody. I know I've been saying to people, keep your team small, but I think you've got to have the key decision makers there if you possibly can. Something else that was obvious once it was said to me is the value of having every face on its own screen. And there are two things about that. One is, unless there's a technical problem, everybody should have their video turned on. If you turn the video off, it's just like a phone mediation and nobody can read your face or anything. And the other thing is, I didn't mind it to start with until it was pointed out, but if people are in a large room and there's a big screen at one end and some very small people at the other end, what you're seeing is the view of the room, you can't read anybody's face, you can't have a proper discussion. So I'm going to be recommending that every face needs to be on its own screen. So that's important. One of the things that affects that is document sharing. It's great to share documents, and I've had a mediation where someone did a presentation on PowerPoint at the beginning of the mediation, and it may be there's a tech answer to that, and I'm limited by my own abilities, but if a screen is full of somebody's PowerPoint, you can't see anybody's faces. So while those vital presentations are going on, if people can't see how the people on the other side are receiving it, that's not great. If you've got two screens, then fine, but a lot of people haven't. So perhaps we should minimise the time when faces are not visible. Also, I mean, something you can't avoid is individuals dropping out. And I don't know why. There are some people who throughout a mediation keep dropping out, and you have to keep admitting them back in through the waiting room. They drop out, you admit them back in, pop them back into their virtual breakout room. And that's annoying, but I don't think I can do anything about that. But I think we need to be aware of that for two reasons. One is when a face drops out, all the faces left on the screen move around. So you can't work out who's gone. So Blogs was there, he's now down here, and it's a bit confusing for everybody. I've been trying to keep the conversation going while I'm looking. I can look at the participant list and see who it is who's gone and try and get them back in. But actually, there's probably a case for pausing at that point to say, look, does everybody realise that Blogs has gone? Do you want to pause? Does he need to hear what you're saying right now? Or are we OK to carry on? So that's a lesson learned, I think. So that's the feedback from my participants. I just, if I can take a couple of minutes, I just want to say something about the sense of place and time, because for me, that's always felt very important in a mediation. You arrive at the building, settle yourself down, have a cup of tea, go into the rooms, greet everybody by shaking hands, having some small talk, beginning to build the rapport that's going to be so important later on, because we're going to need to trust each other. Starting the process, kicking it off, and then at the end of the day, ending it with a signed settlement agreement. Somebody walks out with something that they're glad they've got, hopefully. And then on the way home, you've got the transition. You can change your mindset from mediation to home, and it puts some distance between you. There's a sense that you've said goodbye and you're moving on with life. And for a lot of participants in the mediation, it's been a real watershed moment. And that's an important thing to be able to do, to say goodbye and get off home. And I miss all of that. But it may be that we just aren't going to be able to live with that for some time. On the other hand, I do like the fact that if a mediation finishes quite late at night, all I need to do is switch off and find a bottle of wine in the fridge and have a glass to wind down. I haven't got to arrange a taxi or get a tube home. So there is that. One of the bits of feedback I had I thought was very interesting about this sense of time and place. And it's this: you lose the tension that travelling to chambers or the other side solicitors' offices generates, that can build momentum and give parties the feeling that this is now getting very real, and that promotes a desire to settle. And then also being up against the clock at the other end of the day, got to get home for dinner, get the last train home, get to the pub. It can generate a real momentum and desire to settle, and that's very important. And I don't think we can recreate that in a virtual mediation. The other thing we can't engineer, and I'll just finish on this, is chance encounters. And many people have heard me say this before. I like to loiter outside the toilets in a mediation, and I know that sounds a little unsavoury, but often you want to speak to somebody on their own, and their team may be very protective. And if you say, "Would you come and talk to me, please?" the team will say, "What do you want to talk to him about?" No, we don't. We're not happy with that. And that becomes very awkward and uncomfortable. Whereas most people go to the toilet at some point in the day, and if you're lucky, you can catch somebody as they're walking down the corridor, and you can have a conversation. You can begin it very casually. "How's it going for you? How do you feel? I just wanted to ask you about this." I don't think there's any way I can do that on a virtual mediation. But hey ho, we have to keep learning the lessons. If we can't meet up, I think this is a very good second best. So thank you very much. I've gone a little bit over time. I knew I would, but I think Robert's going to chair some questions, and thank you very much for the questions you've given us so far. Thank you, Robert.
Yes, thank you, Rosemary. Thank you for doing that. We have had a few questions. Can I start? I'm going to ask this one to Rosemary because she's still warm from her very fascinating, helpful talk. And it's this: how can participants be comforted that the risk level of listening inadvertently or otherwise, is minimal?
Okay, that's something that at the beginning of lockdown kept me awake at night, because it was the one thing that really worried me. And we all saw the publicity about people being Zoom bombed and awful sexual abuse videos suddenly being shown in somebody's meeting. I think a lot's been done to tighten up security. I know Zoom's been the focus of a lot of that. They've brought out a lot of software fixes to change things. And I think there are a number of things you can do. One is to have, as regards who the parties let in and the attendees, having a protocol such as the one we have requires everybody to sign up to say, "I won't let anybody else in the room. If anybody else is there, I will say so, and they must say so. If I find myself in the wrong room, I will say so immediately." But there are a lot of things. So you invite people by an invitation with a link, which is a link that only the recipients of the email can get. The meetings are password protected. You can see who's on the screen. You can see all the faces and their names. If there's somebody you don't recognise, you can challenge them. If somebody dials in by phone, I always immediately unmute them, ask them to identify themselves, and then I write their name on so we know who they are. So if there's somebody who shouldn't be there, you can stop, you can get rid of them. But you can see them, you can see everybody who's there. So I think that's really important. There is a facility now on Zoom where you can lock down your meeting once everybody's in, so that there's no chance of anybody getting in. And I was going to do that one day last week, and then I had the problem of somebody who kept dropping out. And I realised that if somebody dropped out, they couldn't then dial back in again, I don't think, if I've locked the meeting down. But actually, I've had no problems, and I felt very secure. I think we've done all we can. And most people are now telling me that their IT departments are saying Zoom is now as secure as it can be, and as secure as Skype and Teams and all of the other software.
That's great. Thank you, Rosemary. a question I think which is aimed at Fionnuala, and I'll just read it here from the chat board. Your suggestions for preparation require more front-loaded mediator involvement than is usual for many in-person mediations. Have you found the parties to be resistant to that?
I haven't. I thought I might do, but I take a fair amount of time explaining why it's important and how it prepares for success. And I think also quite a lot of people, this is new for everybody, isn't it? And it's slightly less new for us now because we've individually and collectively done quite a few. So I think parties will take advice about how to make it work and are pleased to join earlier calls and to understand how it might work and to be talked through it. And I think that settles their concerns about doing mediation on a screen. So far I haven't encountered resistance, and I'm pretty firm in explaining that it just needs to be done in order to make it work, because we all want success at the end of the day. People buy into it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I agree with that entirely. I think people, the parties and their legal advisors are very happy to do the extra work because it's all there for the benefit of them and their clients. A question here which I'll take. Could you please advise whether there are written rules or recommended practices for virtual mediation? A limited answer here, as I think I mentioned and Fionnuala mentioned, Keating Chambers has its own protocol for virtual mediations. It's not published, it's not disseminated widely, but it is sent out to parties when they sign up for a mediation with a mediator in Chambers. There is one other document I'm aware of. It's the CEDA document, which is Mediator Guide to Online Mediation. And I think that is available publicly if anybody wants to view it. I'm not aware of anything else, but I have to say I've not searched widely for any other guidelines or any other principles. We've had two questions about success and settlement rates. Are they higher or lower? I think that's probably one we could all provide an input into. But if I may, Rosemary, can I start with you? Are the chances of success, do you think, in virtual mediation greater, less, or the same?
I think that's really hard, and I think it's too early to tell. I know there are mediators all over LinkedIn saying, oh my God, I got a deal in 5 hours, it's brilliant. I think they're hard, and I think they need some follow-up a lot of the time. So I don't know is the answer.
It's a very honest answer, Fionnuala.
I would agree with what Rosemary says. I just think it's too early to say. I've had some which were definitely more difficult, but I also had one which was a kind of textbook response to mediation. It's what they taught you about back at in mediator school all those years ago, and no one ever really does it. And actually, it happened. I mean, people started to move close together really early on, and it really embraced the process. And so I think it's too early to say. And I mean, my feeling is that this is going to be part of our toolkit going forward. It's not going to go away when lockdown, has gone away. There'll be some mediations for which it will be absolutely perfect, and others for which it will be not perfect.
Fionnuala, that's helpful. I'll come back to that second point you made, or last point you made, and I agree. It is too soon to see any trends, but I do have the feeling that, and I may come back to this later, we are living in a very uncertain world in uncertain times, and that I just get a feeling that there may be nothing to do with the skill of the mediator, but a willingness on the part of parties, or at least some parties, to try and at least see off part of the commercial risks in their organisation or their business. But Fionnuala, your comment at the end relates directly for another question, which is paraphrasing. Do you think virtual mediation will remain a fixture in the mediation toolkit after lockdown, or do you think we'll revert to the traditional face-to-face mediations, the old world mediations, I call them? Again, perhaps I can start with Fionnuala, and then Rosemary, if you've got any observations on that, I think they'd be welcome.
I can't see a world in which we will just forget about doing it virtually. I just can't see that, because having discovered that we can do it, and actually it's much easier than we feared. And of course, there are some parts of it that are harder than doing it in person. Of course, that's right. But for some mediations, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to be more convenient. It's going to be, if you've got people all over the world, you haven't got to fly them into one place. And I think probably Rosemary can say a bit more about that. So I think it's with us, and we need to embrace it and refine it and make it as good as it can be. And we will do that as experience grows. Can I pass back to Rosemary now?
Yeah, Rosemary.
Yes, I think particularly in international mediations, I think we're going to do things differently. I think we're very aware of our carbon footprints, and the idea of flying lots of people around the world doesn't seem quite as sensible and attractive anymore if you could do it by Zoom. So I've got something coming up, and I think there are parties or attendees in 8 different time zones, and we're going to do that by a virtual mediation. And it's going to mean some of us working a bit earlier in the morning or later at night than we might have otherwise done. But we're going to be able to do it. And actually, it's far less disruptive than flying halfway around the world and getting jet lag and all the expense of that. So, yeah, I think it is here to stay.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. And I did a mediation yesterday, which involved the main decision maker from an American parent company calling in, albeit at 4 o'clock in the morning in America, from Alabama. And he was absolutely crucial. And I'm sure without his involvement, we wouldn't have settled. So I think I agree with that entirely. I think with parties spread around the globe, it's a fantastic opportunity to mediate without all the time and cost of worldwide travel. Thank you for that. I've got 2 more questions here. I'll start with Rosemary on this one because I think it's more her topic. And the question is this: with virtual mediation where the attendees are ordinarily at home, have the panel seen their virtual mediations go even longer into the night than in-person mediations? If so, how does the mediator control this?
I've had one go until, one go until about 11 o'clock, but that was with a lot of parties, and really we wanted to have 2 days for the mediation, but we could only find 1. I've also had mediations where we've agreed to have a hard stop. We've said, let's stop at 6 o'clock, and that's going to happen come what may, which I think can be good. But if not a hard stop, I think it's quite important to have a target stop. And I'll very often say, let's try and finish this within a business day. Which, get it all done and signed up by 6 o'clock, which I would do in a face-to-face mediation as well. And to have a reality check in the middle of the afternoon to say, are we getting somewhere? And if not, do we need to do it differently? Let's not just assume we can go until midnight just because we're all at home, because it's an abuse. People have allowed me into their home and they've got children to feed, they've got dogs to walk. I think we have to be very understanding. So I would always want to say halfway through the afternoon, how are we going? Is this getting us where we need to? And then at 6 o'clock, are you happy to go on any longer? Do you think we're getting somewhere? If you do, I'm happy to be there with you. But so that people don't feel that they must keep going.
Fionnuala, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with everything that Rosemary said, and in all the mediations I've done, we've established really early on that people have got children or whatever, and they have to stop at 6 o'clock. So they've told me that, and I think it's, again, in preparation, knowing that means people have got to make progress on the day, and you can remind them. You can say, we can't, we know X can't stay, and they're a major decision maker. It's not to say I wouldn't do it, but I think Rosemary's right. It is an abuse, and we are in different times. We can't sit in the room till midnight. People haven't got someone at home who's holding the baton while they're away. So it's a discipline, I think. Yeah,
thank you for that, and I agree. I won't elaborate further because we're running out of time, and there's two more questions I'd like to ask. What is your experience with documenting and or signing any settlement reached between the parties in a virtual setting? Is agreement captured immediately with the parties signing immediately in some informal way or electronically? If I can just add my experience, I mentioned a mediation I did yesterday. The parties had agreed terms and were exchanging emails. but hadn't concluded it. And in fact, one party needed to check something the next day. So as soon as we finish this webinar, I will be in touch with them to find out how they've got on. Another one I did, terms were agreed, they were all fairly certain, there was no doubt about it. Everybody left apart from the two lawyers who then thrashed out the agreement. I think mainly due to technology reasons, that took them quite a long time, but they did get there. I don't know how they signed that actually, but I was told the following day that it had all been sorted. It's something that's already been mentioned, but I think most mediators will always ask at least one of the parties to bring along a draft settlement agreement so that time is saved on the day. I think nowadays parties are to be encouraged to try and agree in advance the broad terms of the settlement agreement. Of course, it depends what the terms of the settlement are, but it can save a huge amount of time rather than reinventing the wheel, starting with a fairly comprehensive document. I see we're out of time. I'm going to just ask one last question just to hopefully amuse people to some extent, and it's this: what is the worst slip you have had so far? Rosemary, can you help with that?
Thank you. I think this is about just remembering where everybody is. At the end of a mediation, I had all the parties together just to talk about how we'd done, the progress we'd made. I then said goodbye to them. I went off to find my glass of wine and realised I'd left them all in a main session together, whereas what people really want to do is regroup in their own rooms and just have a chat. That's what they do in a face-to-face mediation. They'd get together, they'd go home when they're good and ready. And I did realise as I poured the glass of wine that I'd done that. Luckily, I hadn't closed the meeting. I had just left it. I don't know why I had done that. So I was able to get back in and apologise and then put them in their rooms. And then I could watch slowly as their names disappeared from their rooms after they'd had a goodbye chat. But that was a good lesson.
Fionnuala, anything there, or I'm happy to wrap up otherwise?
Well, do you know, I don't want to tempt fate by saying there hasn't been one so far, but I have had, I was on a video conference and one of my cats who can gain access to my study without my control jumped up and walked right across my screen. And I contemplated just ignoring it, but felt I had to apologise to the parties.
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, I think a bit like you there, but for the grace of God go I with some of these things. And I've had the dog wander in, but fortunately not in front of the screen. Anyway, I think it's time that that this was wrapped up. I hope that you found this webinar helpful. I'll just conclude by saying this: virtual mediation does work. I think all three of us can attest to that. And as already alluded to, if you mediate, you or your client may not get the very best outcome available, but it certainly will not get the worst. But most importantly, what it will get is certainty in a very uncertain world. And with that thought, thank you all very much.